Welcome back, Honors! Alright, so let's get into our very last ism of this entire unit, right? So I can go ahead and throw up like a little running screen of all the isms that we've covered, right? We've covered conservatism, we've covered socialism, we've covered classical liberalism, even though I just said those things out of order. We also covered nationalism. We've loosely covered capitalism and communism, but we're going to give a little asterisk to those guys because they're going to be very, very friction, tension things later. But now we're including our fifth biggest ism, the one highlighted in red, imperialism, right? So coming all back over here, we're now getting into this idea of the death of colonialism, but the growth of imperialism. Because here's the way I want to pitch it to you real quick. Just because colonialism's dying, does that mean that a bunch of Europeans during this time period are going to be okay with not making all the money that they once made before? Of course not. Europe and their empires, the quadruple alliance of Great Britain and Prussia and Russia and Austria, as well as not limited to France getting back in this game eventually after their revolution process is done, is going to start seeking out foreign markets so they can grow their supply of raw materials coming in, shove them into the factories that have been built ever since the Industrial Revolution, and really start churning some stuff out. So they can then, ironically enough, take these goods and sell them back to the primitive peoples that didn't even realize they had goods that the Europeans wanted in the first place. So, let's go ahead and get into it. It's a crazy, convoluted thing, but you know what? I like it. There's not going to be a ton of editing in this video, simply because I think that this subject is super captivating the way that it is. It explains so much of the modern world and the way it functions. Why West Africa speaks French. Why Chez Pierre, a Vietnamese French bakery, exists. Like, why can I buy bubble tea at a French bakery? Oh, well, imperialism explains that. Imperialism is, I think, the most interesting ism, and it's one that I think deserves a lot of, just a lot of different things, a lot of different ideas. And we're going to talk about a ton of different cool stuff, especially with the honors group, because y'all deserve it. And I'm currently reading a book about imperialism right now. I'll go ahead and throw it up there. It's a phenomenal book. It's very hard to read, though, just simply because it's so sad. It's called King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, and it's about the Belgian conquest of the Congo. So if you're ever interested in where I got a lot of the information from, go ahead and check that one out. It's very, very good. And then also, I'm going to go ahead and attach a couple of videos, some supplementary videos at the bottom in the description, that if you're interested in these things, you can definitely check out. Feature History does a great episode on Opium Wars. Crash Course European History does a great episode on imperialism, which will then, again, talk a lot about the things that we're going into right now. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it, though, shall we? Imperialism. Let's talk about where it started, where it came from, and biggest thing is don't mute these videos, or else you're officially someone who breathes out of their mouth, like so. Yeah, nobody likes Eli Manning in the first place. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. So, we are now talking about imperialism. Today, in your extension assignment, you're going to be looking at some political cartoons that I actually think y'all did a phenomenal job of making yourself, but now that we're getting into this use of hyperbole and imagery to explain political concepts, I think it's super important that you keep getting used to seeing these things. Mainly due to the fact that all the girls moving on to AP next year, you're going to need to know them because the AP US test loves to use them because a lot of our history has been captured in political cartoons. And for the rest of you who are going into honors, you need to know this stuff as well because I know Miss Palladino likes to use it. Shout out Miss Palladino and her coffee chats and all the other cool, amazing things she does, but she's going to want you to know how to look at one of these and analyze it as well. So let's keep going forward, though. The policy of extending the rule of an authority of an empire or nation over foreign countries is the kind of a good working definition for imperialism. Some of y'all are going to go ahead and go back to your other notes. You're going to be like, well, when you were talking about colonialism versus imperialism, you were saying that it's using your power, your politics or your military. Well, yeah, we'll get into that stuff here in a couple of minutes. But basically, in a nutshell, imperialism is the policy of extending the rule of a foreign territory over that of foreign countries. And 9 times out of 10, it's a very, very economically developed, industrially developed, modern country, usually in Europe or the United States, which you'll see in the extension assignment today. We did a lot of imperialism as well. It's not, but the big one, the biggest perpetrator is this guy right here. That is Great Britain. And this is a fantastic political cartoon that you'll be looking at and analyzing later. So let's keep going. All right, so let's talk about why. Why do people want to, imperialize? What was the big deal? Why was all of a sudden this idea of let's go over and take over non-modernized indigenous people of other places and use their resources for us? What is the big motivation behind that? Well, the biggest one, of course, is economics. It's making cash, right? That's why, all right? So, that is the biggest reason why anybody wants to do anything in Western civilizations. It's money-making stuff. And by the late 1800s, Europe is gonna own most of the world, right? So if you were to look at a map of imperialism, or maybe if I find one, I'll throw one up real quick, maybe not. So, we'll, go ahead and try to check that out later. But, the biggest thing about it is colonialism is dying. So the ideas of having a colony in a foreign land ran by people from your country to make, produce, and sell you raw materials is now a dying idea. Due to the fact that every time they tried to start a colony in the 1500s, they now have all revolted. Latin America is now independent. Haiti is now independent. Mexico is now independent. The United States is now independent. All these countries are now independent. So the Europeans are kind of looking around like, oh no, where are we going to get all of our stuff from now? So they decide that they're going to be even more advantageous. Whereas back in the day, colonialism involved you buying raw materials from your colonies. Now they're going to just take them. All right. So and by the 1800s, Europeans are going to end up owning most of the world. This is all spurred by the pursuit of money. They went out to try and take over foreign countries and continents like Africa, Southeast Asia. Those are the two big ones. Africa and Southeast Asia in the pursuit of goods like palm oil, rubber, cotton, iron, copper, gold, diamonds, all those things. Now, one of the big ones, though, of course, that's really good to use is this good right here called palm oil. Palm oil was actually used in the factories to keep the machines from breaking down. So it became a very, very super, super big necessity during the post-industrial economics of Europe. Rubber is going to become a huge thing, especially in the 1900s when automobiles start to be developed in mass, right? Henry Ford, thank you very much. And the rubber needed for the tires is going to become a huge need. Cotton, iron, another big one you can add to this list is still ivory, though. One of the biggest luxury goods of all time, and it still was even in the late 1800s. So, economics is the big reason why they decide they want to go take over everybody. But another big reason why is this new concept of nationalism. That's right, nationalism is going to play into the ideas of imperialism, because what is nationalism again? It's this concept that you have pride in your country, or you believe that your people have a genius in and of themselves. And so this concept is going to lead to kind of a weird little competition, right? A little kind of weird competition between the peoples of different countries against one another. So for example, one of the biggest ones is the British. The British began to look at themselves as the best imperializers in the world. They used to believe that, we own more colonies. Write this down, jot this down, very important. The sun never sets on the British Empire. That quote is forever going to be espoused in every single high school classroom for the next hundreds of years due to the fact that it's not false. By 1890, Great Britain, owned an empire so big through their imperialism and their imperialistic tactics that every second sun was shining on it somewhere. That is mind-blowing, that they own stuff all over the world. That's terrifying, too, when you think about it. Now, getting further into it, though, Europe is going to also keep pushing forward. But here's a cool little primary source for you. An ABC book for baby patriots produced in 1899 by Mrs. Ernest Ames. Look at what B stands for. B stands for battles by which England's name has forever been covered with glory and fame. And C stands for colonies. Rightly we boast that of all the great nations, Great Britain has the most, because that sun will never set on the British Empire. Oh. And then another huge reason why it's a big motivator as to why they wanted to go out there, these are like the smaller ones. These are the JV level motives. Religion, military outposting, and foreign markets. Now, some of you are saying, well, didn't you just say economics? Shh, calm down. I'm talking about foreign markets as in going to these places to find someone else to buy your goods. Yes, this is going to become a big deal, but their primary people they're trying to sell to are their own citizens and or other first world countries. Like if Britain can produce cheap cotton textiles to then sell to everybody else in Europe because they have colonies in India where they thought they were going to grow cotton, but it actually didn't work out because guess who was king of cotton? Oh, it was the United States of America. Due to the slavery and everything else we were getting into. But military outposts are going to be kind of another JV one, and religion, the spread of religion to convert the hedonistic beliefs of all these foreigners, which is so racist, it doesn't even make sense. Now, keep going, though. Those are your smaller motivations. But now let's ponder the question of why. Why did this take so long? Why hadn't they done this earlier? Why hadn't the Europeans decided to imperialize some junk earlier on instead of 1850? 1850 serves as the year. It's like the starting pistol year for the boom. Yes, Katie Hedrick and Brittany Berrettini and Jaden Migliori and Ali Marcus and even whoever else runs track for Chappelle. Keep running, keep getting after it, but the starting pistol year is 1850. Why hadn't they done this earlier? Well, a lot of it is due to the fact that leading up to this point, they didn't have the technology that they needed to be able to go out there and do it. Some of you are saying, well, they had colonies over in America and Latin America. How come they couldn't just go take over other people somewhere else? Well, mainly because you got two main places that they're going to choose to take over. You've got Asia, which is gonna have some modernizations leading up to 1850. They had some loose use of guns and naval equipment and things like that. But up until 1850, Europe would have been competing with Asia in wars that would have killed a lot of their soldiers, bare none. And also Asia had a lot more soldiers and troops and population than European did. So they couldn't take them on one-on-one in a war. Now, the other big one, Africa. And some of you are saying, well, even if the British and the French and the Belgians, who were going to be major players in this, had muskets, then they were already more modern than Africa, so your rule, Mr. Terry, then doesn't apply. Well, look, if you would sit there and listen for a second, you would understand that the big reason why it took them so long to imperialize Africa was due to the fact that Africa is near impossible to navigate the interior of. Because what is the area that we've already talked about when we're talking about Africa? The coastline and going all the way around it to get to India for spices, shout out Vasco da Gama, going around all these different things. They're being on the coastlines of Africa to pick up slaves at different forts, usually going into the 1800s. That's what Africa was mainly used for. But no European could make it into what was known as the interior, which we will talk about later. And a lot of this is due to the fact that they didn't have ways to travel. Boom, one, pre-1850. And second of all, before 1850, they didn't have ways to fight off disease like malaria or the yellow fever, or there's another one that's transferred by the tsetse fly, and I can't remember what it is. I'll look it up and put it up here. Anyway, it's a super scary disease. Now, steamboats are going to create steamboats, factories, machines, and a big one right here, the Maxim gun, is going to be the reason why they have the ability to so easily take over places like Africa and modern medicines like this stuff right here called quinine medicine, which is still today used in very, 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 very big effects to cure malaria. Quinine medicine is going to be a big thing that they can use to stay alive inside the Africa without, dying. So getting into it, technology helped them spread. Like I said, new things like steamboats, factories, machines, the Maxim gun, which is the very first machine gun, and modern medicines are going to give them the ability to now go out and take over all these other places that they once never actually had the ability to go out and take over. So really quick, which is going to be the one we talk about? Oh yeah, the British. All right, when you're talking about imperialism, 9 times out of 10, you're talking about the Brits, okay? The British are the most ridiculous imperializers of all time. Some of y'all, look, if I got a British person listening to this right now, which I highly doubt I do, but if I do, you know you did it. You know your people did it. It is what it is, all right? Y'all got museums full of their stuff, all right? So now, anyway, Britain in China is one of the biggest early examples, okay? And then we're also going to talk about the British in India, and then we're also going to talk about, we don't get time to talk about the British in Africa. The big ones we focus on in Africa is a Holocaust-level atrocity that occurred in Africa, known as the Belgian Conquest of Congo, led by, of course, Leopold II, the book that I'm reading right now. So, okay, real quick, let's understand why the British decided that they were going to mosey on over to China. Let's rewind back real quick, okay? So, us, now we now we're here. The British in China, okay? So in the 1790s, Britain has zero money. Okay, Britain is wildly in debt by the 1790s due to things like the Napoleonic Wars, the American Revolution, or as they called it, the American Revolt, a bunch of mean, gun-toting, crazy people when we look at them as freedom fighters, which is another big misconception. Feature History has a great video that talks about that entire concept. But looking at this really fast, one country that is not broke is China. China wasn't broke even a little bit by the 1790s. China was also economically self-isolated. China refused to trade with anyone else because they didn't need to. All the goods that China needed were made inside of China already. So they economically isolated themselves. Remember when we talked about geographic isolation? When we talked about it all the way back with the Greeks? This is like economic isolation. The Chinese are literally saying, we don't need to send boats to Britain to go get their stuff because we already make our own stuff. They processed all their own goods already. They made porcelain. They made tea. They made silk. They made so much different stuff that they adopted a system of importing goods or buying things from Westerners if they absolutely had to. But it was called the Canton system. So all the way down in the southern area of China, I'm going to throw a map up here real quick, all the way down in the southern area of China, there's this little area called Canton, all right? Canton is a city off the coast near Hong Kong, and in Canton, that is the one city that Westerners were allowed to go pick up items and or sell anything they had. And it was bought by a group of Chinese merchants who would tax it all the way they wanted to, and then they would sell it within China to prevent Westerners and or foreign merchants from going into their country. It's a genius system when you think about it because it prevents you from ever having to have full-scale, large international warfare over trade goods, which is what the Europeans have become professionals at since 1492. All right, but going further, the big good out of all of them, porcelain, tea, silk, all that stuff. The biggest one out of all of them was tea. Literally, the Brits were addicted to it. Like it was a drug. 10% of every single British household, 10% of their income went to purchasing tea. The absolute, like, ingrained societal aspect in Great Britain of tea time, of drinking tea, your first cup of Earl Grey in the morning, has been entrenched into the British psyche since before 1790. And where are they buying all of it from? China. Where are they not making money off of it? China. Because they're, like, remember, China can charge you whatever they want because they're one of the only producers of it. So they were completely fine with charging the Brits large amounts of money and for the British to, like, keep buying it very, very expensive. And so what is Britain to do? What are they going to do? We got to spend so much money on tea, and if I don't have it, I get all shaky. Well, the big thing about it is they were so addicted to tea that they turned to one of the most screwed up things that I've ever heard of in my entire life. So let's go ahead and keep going forward. And as we know, economically isolated China, making mad cash. Britain got no money, addicted to Chinese tea. So what is a British person to do? Oh, I don't know. Let's talk about drugs, shall we?
Because drugs are bad, okay? It's a bad thing to do drugs, so don't be bad by doing drugs, okay?
Yeah, so the British are going to decide to sell drugs to the Chinese in exchange for tea, which is one of the most screwed up things that has ever happened in all of history. Britain is losing massive amounts of money on their tea addiction, so the Brits decide that they're going to trade opium, a drug that makes a lot of modern-day narcotics, including heroin, as well as painkillers in our society, which somehow those things are legal, but don't even get me started. But anyway, opium, this stuff right here, and you come into contact with it on a daily basis if you eat a poppy seed bagel. But of course, that old myth about don't eat a poppy seed bagel and drug tests, you have to eat like huge amounts of poppy seeds to register on anything. But anyway, poppies, these little guys. Anybody remember Wizard of Oz? Remember this scene?
With poison in it, I think. With poison in it. But attractive to the eye and soothing to the smell. Poppies. Poppies. Poppies will put them to sleep.
Yeah. Poppies and opium-based drugs are supposed to, they're a huge, opium is a huge depressant. Causes sleep. The person who is using opium usually slips into this deep, almost catatonic state, and opium is wildly addictive as well. So they decide to start trading opium for tea, straight up. Britain planned to grow opium, or poppies, these flowers, of course, again, featured in Wizard of Oz. They're going to grow opium in India and trade it for the Chinese tea and sell it for a massive profit in England, because they can grow the opium for next to nothing in India and then trade Chinese merchants and smugglers the opium for the tea, because here's the thing. The Chinese merchants want opium. Why? Because it's stupid illegal in China. And if they can sell it on the streets, they can make even more money than they ever would have off tea. So the British people are going to trade drugs to people to finance their own addiction to caffeine, which everyone is addicted to. Like, everyone wants caffeine. I had 3 cups of caffeine at least today already. This is why I'm so energetic all the time. But this is one of the most screwed up things in all of history, because the British decide to grow drugs for next to nothing, trade it for tea so they can make a lot of money off the death and suffering of people overdosing and having drug addictions in China. So when this starts to occur, the Chinese decide that they are not having this, and they start trying to stop the British at all costs. The emperor actually employs a task force led by this guy named I think it's like Lin Xiaozu. I'll throw up his name if I actually got it wrong. But the Chinese try to stop the sale of opium by seizing it at ports and going in and shutting down drug dens, or opium dens as they were called, and finally confiscating any opium they can find and destroying it. And at one point, they actually caught 21,000 chests of opium at one of these seizures, and they burned all of it. Now, I don't think you understand how much 21,000 chests of opium is worth on the drug market, and how much it was worth to the British people. The British were like 21,000 chests of opium now gone is 21,000 chests of tea that they didn't get, not to mention the fact that the Chinese smugglers are very upset because they're not going to be making millions of dollars. It was worth millions, quite possibly over $1 trillion. I don't know, I'm ballparking it. But millions of, not trillion, that's aggressive, like $1 billion. Like, it was worth a ridiculous amount of money. So the Brits demanded that the Chinese give them money to compensate for the drugs that they took, and then these things called the Opium Wars broke out. The first one is going to break out from 1839 to 1842, and it's going to end with this thing called the Treaty of Nanking, known as the first of the unequal treaties, because now China is going to start being opened up to foreign merchants. And And it's very, very messed up. Now, in the Second Opium War, which breaks out later, also, again, due to these sketchy trade negotiations that the British want to impose on the Chinese from 1853 to 1860, is going to break out. And the Chinese are going to lose both of these wars. Both of them. Both. All right? Lose both of the wars because they were technologically so far behind the British. Oh, and the Americans and the French and the Russians. Because in the very first war, it was Britain versus China, and the British Navy destroyed the Chinese. And they actually are going to, like I said, enter into that thing called the Treaty of Nanking. And in the Treaty of Nanking, it's something ridiculous. Like, the Canton system was, like thrown out. That was allowed, that British were allowed to go and, like, trade along several different port cities now. And they basically were just, like, totally taking advantage of, like, China in total. And the reason why China was so unable to fight these wars is because most of their military officers and men were still running in with spears, shields, bows and arrows, and, like, swords, whereas the Brits had cannons and gunpowder weapons and all these other things that, ironically enough, you know who invented gunpowder first? The Chinese. So a lot of historians have debated. They were like, wait a minute. Why the Chinese were technologically so far ahead of Europe for thousands of years. For thousands, they invented the first printing press, they invented gunpowder, they invented legal systems before the Europeans ever did. And why did they fall so dramatically far behind? A lot of historians point back to that economic isolation. Yes, was China able to stay economically very, very, very well off? Yes. Were they able to avoid international war? Yes. You're avoiding international war, you lose the stimulus to modernize because you don't have to try and fight your enemies in an ever-increasing modern war. So the Brits are going to wreck the Chinese in the Opium Wars. And the massive results of these wars is the main one is that China is going to be quote-unquote opened. And spheres of influence are going to be established. Now, you could go way, way in depth with the Opium Wars if you wanted to. You could really talk about, like, the reactions of the Chinese, why they ended up losing, specific battles that caused these losings. You could talk about for a long, long time how there was at one point this Chinese general demanded that a British sailor be executed, and then they didn't do it, and that led to a big thing. You could go super in-depth with them, but we just don't have that kind of time right now. Now, China was going to be opened, and what I mean by that is when they were economically isolated, it was like those doors were shut to, like, all of the Westerners. They were not allowed in. They were not allowed to come in and trade inside of China. They had to trade to the members of the Canton system, and the Canton system people would go into China and sell the goods there. Now, because of these Opium Wars, China was, quote-unquote, opened with these unequal treaties. And these things called spheres of influence were established, which are port cities for certain European countries to go and trade their goods in those areas and take advantage of the Chinese that live there. So all Chinese ports are like Britain, were open. Britain buys or just takes Hong Kong, and they didn't even give that back until I think 1995. And then international trade is going to go wild. Merchants are going to be subject to Chinese laws, but merchants weren't subject to Chinese laws, only subject to the laws of their home countries. So they could do whatever they wanted in China, regardless of China's laws, but only had to live up to the laws of their own country. That's messed up. And China has to end up paying them. At one point, they paid them 20 million pounds. 20 million pounds in 1850 is worth billions now. So let's back it up again. You showed up and were mad because they were doing better than you money-wise. And so you decided to sell them drugs to force their people to become massively addicted to a drug. And then you made them pay you so you could take advantage of their cities? Yeah, it's crazy. So rebellions are going to rise up in response to the now fractured and destroyed political outlook of the Chinese people, because they're now going to start looking towards their governments and be like, we thought y'all were god kings and like the ever guiding light of our people. And so that's going to mess a lot of things up. And the Taiping Rebellion is going to break out, and then the Boxer Rebellion is going to break out. And these uprisings are going to be crushed at the loss of millions of Chinese lives. Over 20 million people died in the Taiping Rebellion alone. Just that. Now put that on the grand scale of things when you're talking about other genocides and atrocities. But why do these things not get talked about too much? Because people don't like to think that modern Europeans would do this to other people, and also because the people involved were not European. So it was a crime, a very different set of crimes, if you understand what I'm saying. So anyway, getting into it though, this right here, every single little color code you see was opened. These are port cities open to other places. So you got the French down here in Vietnam, down in Canton and Hong Kong. The British controlled this entire area. Russia actually controlled an area to the north towards Korea. The Japanese are going to pull up on this area over here. And even the French were or not even the French, but even the Americans used this thing called gunboat diplomacy to take over areas in Japan. And then they're going to try and go through Japan to get the Chinese goods. So, like, as you can see, like, imperialism is wild. And what we're going to talk about in our next flip is going to be the British in India. And then we're going to talk about imperialism in Africa as well. But that's going to be it. That's all for this flip. I will see you guys later on. Y'all are doing fantastic. Start studying for that test, because just to give you a heads up, the test is going to have a time limit on it. So do not sit and rest on your laurels of trying to take an open note test thinking you have hours to do it, because you only get 1 hour. So there's that. I will talk to you guys later. Y'all have a great rest of your day, because it's Monday, but I'm recording this on a Sunday. But I'll talk to you guys later. Y'all have a good one.